Did you know that the man who owned the Titanic had booked a personal suite for its maiden voyage and then never boarded? Tonight, we'll unfold the mystery of J.P. Morgan's no-show. We'll explore the theories, from illness and mistresses to scandal and conspiracy, and finally uncover the real facts of what happened to the most powerful man of his age on the night the Titanic sailed without him. The Titanic was more than just a ship. In April 1912, it was a floating palace, chandeliers, marble staircases, velvet-carpeted suites, and an orchestra on call to play you to sleep. The world's elite scrambled for tickets, desperate to be seen aboard the most glamorous voyage of the century. And at the very top of that social pyramid stood J.P. Morgan. He wasn't just a passenger. He owned the shipping line that built the Titanic. His suite, one of the most luxurious ever designed for a ship, was already prepared. He was supposed to be there, presiding like a king on his floating castle. But when the Titanic pulled out of port, Morgan was not on board. At the very last moment, he cancelled. His excuse, vague business matters in France. What really happened? Was it a convenient illness, a secret lover, a whispered scandal? Or, as some conspiracy theorists like to suggest, did Morgan know more about the Titanic than he ever admitted? For decades, his absence has been a question mark, a detail that turns one of history's greatest tragedies into something stranger. And tonight, we'll trace that trail of theories, scandals, and speculation before we finally get to the truth. Picture it, the Titanic at dock, gleaming in the spring sunlight, its 4 colossal smokestacks towering over the harbour like cathedral spires of industry. At nearly 900 feet long, it was the largest moving object on Earth, a marvel of steel, rivets, and sheer ambition. But this wasn't just an engineering feat. It was designed to be the ultimate expression of luxury, a palace disguised as a ship. Step inside, and the world shifts from salt air and coal smoke to velvet carpets and golden light. The grand staircase rose in a sweeping oak curve, its wrought iron balustrades curling like lace, topped with a glittering glass dome that spilled sunlight into the heart of the ship. There were chandeliers, Turkish baths, reading rooms stocked with leather-bound books, and dining salons more opulent than most London hotels. The first-class passengers were treated not just to comfort, but to spectacle. Imagine multi-course dinners served on fine china, French champagne flowing into crystal flutes, and an orchestra hired solely to provide a soundtrack to your elegance. The Titanic wasn't built to get people across the Atlantic quickly. It was built to make them feel like gods for a week. And who were these gods? Aristocrats in pearls and tiaras, American millionaires in dinner jackets, European celebrities eager to be seen. Among them, John Jacob Astor IV, the richest man on the ship, traveling with his pregnant young wife. Isidore and Ida Strauss, owners of Macy's department store. Nobility from Europe, business titans from America, all boarding this floating social club with their trunks piled high with gowns and silver-backed brushes. The Titanic was a symbol of the age's excess, a final curtain call for the Edwardian obsession with glamour and status. But behind this glittering tableau, one name loomed larger than any passenger list: J.P. Morgan. Because this wasn't just a ship for Morgan, it was his ship. Here's the added segment, written in your bedtime history tone. Immersive, dripping with detail, keeping curiosity alive without tipping into resolution yet. If you had stepped aboard the Titanic in April 1912, the first thing you'd have noticed was that it did not feel like a ship at all. It felt like a grand hotel. Or perhaps a royal palace that had simply decided to float. The first-class lounge glowed with carved oak paneling, velvet upholstered chairs, and chandeliers that seemed to drip light like molten gold. The smoking room was styled in dark mahogany with stained glass windows, the kind of place where gentlemen sank into leather armchairs to discuss stock prices and scandals over cigars and brandy. There was even a Parisian-style cafe, complete with wicker chairs and French waiters, designed to make you forget you were anywhere near the Atlantic. Then there was the Turkish bath, an indulgence few had seen before. Imagine a domed room tiled in mosaics, steam swirling through the air, attendants ready with towels and exotic oils. Or the swimming pool, a novelty at sea, with its cool blue tiles and bronze cherubs, a place where the wealthy could paddle between dinner courses. Everywhere, the Titanic whispered luxury. The carpets were so thick they seemed to swallow footsteps. The china was patterned with delicate crests, the silverware polished until it reflected candlelight like a hall of mirrors. Cabins weren't cabins at all, but suites decorated in styles borrowed from Versailles and the Ritz, Louis XV, Empire, Regency. A passenger could walk from a French drawing room to an English country house to a Renaissance-inspired salon without ever leaving the ship. Meals were not simply food, they were events. 11-course dinners, each paired with wine, each dish served with a flourish. Oysters, filet mignon, roast duck, peaches in chartreuse jelly. A menu designed not to nourish, but to dazzle. And the orchestra played on, moving from morning teas to evening dances, a constant soundtrack of refinement. For the wealthy passengers, life aboard the Titanic was not about crossing an ocean. It was about displaying themselves like jewels in a velvet case, each hoping to outshine the other in conversation, dress, or pedigree. The ship itself became a stage, its grand staircase the spotlight, where all eyes lingered as ladies descended in silk and diamonds. It's no wonder people called it unsinkable, not because of engineering charts or rivet counts, but because it was simply too magnificent to imagine sinking. Who could picture velvet drowning, or chandeliers slipping beneath black waves? The Titanic was luxury incarnate, and it seemed to promise immortality. And waiting for its maiden voyage was one man whose suite was to outshine them all: J.P. Morgan. By 1912, J.P. Morgan was not just rich, he was an institution. The kind of man who didn't just buy companies, but rearranged industries like chess pieces. He had bailed out the US Treasury when the government itself was running out of gold. He owned railroads that stretched across America, steel companies that forged the skeleton of modern cities, and banks that held entire nations in his grip. So when the Titanic was built under the White Star Line, it wasn't simply a ship, it was part of Morgan's empire. Naturally, Morgan wasn't going to travel across the Atlantic in just any cabin. He had reserved Suite B52, 54, 56, also called the Millionaire's Suite. This was no ordinary collection of rooms. It was a floating Versailles. The suite included a drawing room decorated in Louis XV style, a dining room with its own private service, multiple bedrooms, and bathrooms with marble fittings. There was even a private promenade deck, so Morgan wouldn't have to brush shoulders with the Astors, Strausses, or Guggenheims unless he felt like it. Imagine a penthouse hotel built inside a ship, complete with servants trained to respond as if every request were an emergency. Had Morgan boarded, his presence would have made headlines. Here was the man who financed the Titanic, sailing aboard his own creation, surrounded by aristocrats and millionaires he considered more ornaments than equals. He would have strolled the decks with his cigar, perhaps hosted private dinners, and been photographed, begrudgingly because he hated cameras, as the king of the Atlantic. But when the Titanic left Southampton on April 10th, 1912, Suite B, 52, 54, and 56 was empty. The velvet chairs were unused, the private promenade silent, the marble baths dry. For all its splendor, the Titanic's crown jewel of accommodation lacked its intended monarch. The explanation Morgan offered was almost insultingly vague. Business matters. But instead of conducting business in London or New York, he was spotted in Aix-les-Bains, a French spa town known for mineral waters, golf, and more discreet pleasures. This was not Wall Street. This was where wealthy men went to recover from gout, to gamble, to dally with companions who were definitely not their wives, and to enjoy the leisurely pace of Europe's most fashionable invalid retreat. So naturally, tongues wagged. If Morgan wasn't on the Titanic, it wasn't because of urgent board meetings or financial crises. It was because, at 75, he preferred the comfort of a spa and the company of a mistress. His suite remained unused, his name absent from the passenger list, a curious omission given the ship's fate days later. And that curiosity lingers. Because while hundreds of wealthy, entitled passengers boarded the Titanic, the one man who symbolized power above them all, the man who owned the line itself, did not. And when the iceberg came, his absence transformed from a private indulgence into a public question. The official explanation for Morgan's absence was that he was ill. At 75, it wasn't implausible. He suffered from rheumatism, gout, and the general wear and tear of a man who had lived decades of heavy eating, constant cigars, and stress levels that would flatten a lesser mortal. His health had been deteriorating for years, and Aix-les-Bains was the sort of place where the world's elite went to take the waters. Picture it. A town filled with luxury hotels, thermal baths bubbling with mineral-rich steam, and doctors prescribing long walks, light diets, and copious amounts of fresh mountain air. For Morgan, who had spent much of his life in New York's smoky boardrooms, Aix must have felt like an escape hatch. So the excuse of illness fit neatly enough. He was said to be recuperating, too fragile for the rigors of transatlantic travel. But here's where the story loses its shine. Morgan may have been in a spa town for his health, but he wasn't exactly hiding under the covers. Eyewitnesses reported seeing him strolling comfortably, enjoying cigarettes, attending dinners, and most damningly, spending time with a young woman who was not his wife. His supposed frailty looked suspiciously like leisure. In fact, when news of the Titanic's sinking reached the world, Morgan was described as in excellent health. So was illness the truth, or was it a polite smokescreen? Victorian and Edwardian society had a way of turning delicate ailments into acceptable excuses for just about anything. One didn't simply say, "I didn't feel like it." One said, "My nerves were in disorder." And everyone nodded gravely while knowing perfectly well that nerves often meant boredom, avoidance, or something scandalous. The timing is what gnaws at the imagination. Morgan cancelled at the very last minute. His luggage may even have been packed. To change one's plans so suddenly suggested more than just a twinge of gout. Something, or someone, persuaded him to stay behind. And while illness satisfied the polite press releases, gossip magazines of the time and conspiracy theorists of the future would never accept it at face value. Because if Morgan wasn't ill, then what was he hiding? Was it a woman, a secret deal, or, as later whispers claimed, did he know something about the Titanic's voyage that others didn't? Of all the explanations for J.P. Morgan's sudden no-show on the Titanic, the mistress theory is the most deliciously scandalous. And for an audience that adored gossip as much as it adored pearls and champagne, it was irresistible. The whispers began in France, where Morgan was seen not alone in his bathrobe, sipping mineral water in a spa garden, but accompanied by a much younger woman. She was not his wife, Frances Louisa Tracy Morgan, who had long since retreated into the background of his life. No, this companion was said to be one of Morgan's mistresses, part of a shadowy pattern that the press rarely printed in ink, but often murmured in hushed tones. Morgan's appetite for power extended beyond banks and railroads. He was a man of passions, for art, for cigars, for domination in every sense. His face may have been marked by rosacea, his famous purple nose mocked in caricatures, but money has a way of making flaws disappear. Women, particularly those orbiting the glittering worlds of Paris and London society, were drawn into his gravitational pull, and Morgan, discreet but not exactly secretive, did little to resist. So when people saw him in Aix-les-Bains, strolling the promenades, enjoying dinners, perhaps even laughing, they drew their conclusions. If Morgan skipped the Titanic, it wasn't for business. It wasn't even for illness. It was because he preferred the company of a mistress to the formality of a maiden voyage. And isn't that so very human? While Astor and Strauss packed trunks and prepared for society's most glamorous ocean crossing, Morgan chose something far simpler: a spa, a woman, and privacy. The decision looks almost shockingly mundane. Here was the man who had built industries and outmaneuvered governments, quietly choosing a romantic escape over a ship that the world declared unsinkable. The irony, of course, is breathtaking. By skipping out on glamour, he avoided tragedy. One can imagine the whispers at Parisian salons in the weeks after the sinking. Did you hear? Morgan was meant to be on the ship, but no, he was with his mistress. Gasps, knowing glances, a flutter of fans. Scandalous, certainly, but also, in its own twisted way, enviable. Because the mistress theory does more than explain Morgan's absence. It turns him into a character out of a novel, the titan of finance who, on a whim of passion, stepped sideways from history's disaster. It makes him not just powerful, but strangely lucky. The man who dodged an iceberg, not with foresight or engineering charts, but with romance. And whether true or not, the story stuck. After all, scandal makes for better conversation than stomach cramps. But for some, Morgan's absence could not be explained away by illness or romance. It had to mean more. And so, inevitably, the conspiracy theories began. One of the most persistent is that Morgan deliberately avoided the Titanic because he knew it was doomed. The ship, critics whispered, had been rushed into service, its safety corners cut, its lifeboat numbers shockingly inadequate. Morgan, with his insider knowledge, supposedly realized the risk and quietly stepped aside. He sacrificed the passengers, they say, to protect his fortune. Another, even more outlandish theory claims that Morgan orchestrated the disaster itself. According to this myth, some of his financial rivals, men like John Jacob Astor IV, Benjamin Guggenheim, and Isidor Straus, were aboard the Titanic. All three perished. Some conspiracy theorists argue that Morgan let the ship sail into its fate to eliminate them, clearing obstacles to his financial dominance. It's the kind of tale that sounds thrilling in a late-night pub debate, but quickly falls apart under scrutiny. As powerful as Morgan was, even he couldn't choreograph iceberg. Then there's the insurance scam theory. People speculated that the Titanic wasn't the Titanic at all, but her sister ship, the Olympic, disguised after sustaining damage. The sinking, in this telling, was staged to claim insurance money. And Morgan, of course, was the mastermind behind it. The flaw in this theory is almost laughable. No insurance payout could possibly outweigh the cost of losing the most celebrated ship in the world, along with its passengers. But logic has never been the beating heart of conspiracies. Suspicion is. What makes these theories endure is not their credibility, but their drama. They give Morgan a shadowy omniscience, painting him as the puppet master behind both Wall Street and fate itself. To a public that already feared his grip on America's economy, it wasn't hard to imagine him pulling the strings behind the Titanic as well. And even today, the whispers live on. Type JP, Morgan Titanic, into an internet search, and you'll tumble into rabbit holes of articles, podcasts, and videos proclaiming dark secrets. Did he know? Did he plan it? Did he cheat death by sacrificing others? The truth is almost certainly simpler. Morgan was old, tired, and distracted by the comforts of France. But conspiracy theories reveal something important about his reputation. He wasn't seen as just a banker. He was seen as a man so powerful that even icebergs were folded into his myth. And maybe that's the real point. Morgan's absence became larger than the Titanic itself. It turned him into legend, the man too rich, too shrewd, too untouchable to drown. When news of the Titanic's sinking reached the world on April 15, 1912, the shock was immediate and universal. Newspapers that had spent weeks printing glowing articles about the ship's luxury now filled their front pages with grim headlines. Titanic lost. Over 500 dead in Atlantic disaster. Lists of survivors trickled out slowly, agonizingly, as families scanned for familiar names. Among the dead were some of the wealthiest and most influential men of the Gilded Age. John Jacob Astor IV, fortune estimated at $87 million, drowned while his young pregnant wife survived. Isidor Straus, co-owner of Macy's, perished alongside his wife Ida, who famously refused a lifeboat to stay with him. Benjamin Guggenheim died dressed in evening wear, telling fellow passengers, "We've dressed up in our best and are prepared to go down like gentlemen." It was a parade of tragedy, and in the middle of it, one name stood out: J.P. Morgan. Not because he was on the casualty lists, but because he wasn't. Whispers spread quickly. Didn't Morgan have a suite booked? Wasn't he meant to sail? His absence became a story in itself. Newspapers dutifully reported his illness in Aix-les-Bains, but the public was not convinced. The image of Morgan, cigar in hand, leisurely strolling spa promenades, while men like Astor sank into icy black waters, created a tension too rich to ignore. Some were angry. Editorials questioned why Morgan, the ship's financial overlord, hadn't boarded. Was it cowardice, opportunism, or just luck? Others gossiped with relish. At Parisian salons and New York drawing rooms, the story had all the ingredients of irresistible scandal: glamour, death, survival, and the world's most powerful banker choosing comfort over catastrophe. The timing couldn't have been worse for Morgan's reputation. Already criticized in America as the head of the money trust, hauled before Congress just weeks earlier to explain his monopoly on banking, he now appeared aloof and untouchable, literally above disaster. His absence became a metaphor. While others perished, Morgan remained secure, untouched by fate, lounging in a French spa. And yet that irony is what makes the story endure. If Morgan had been on the Titanic, he might have been remembered as one more millionaire who drowned tragically. By not boarding, he became something else entirely: the man who dodged death. His empty suite spoke louder than any presence could. In the weeks after the Titanic, J.P. Morgan's absence hardened into legend. He had not been on the ship, and therefore every theory, every whisper, every raised eyebrow settled into a permanent place in his story. For his critics, it was proof of his selfishness. Here was a man who could bail out governments, but couldn't bother to sail with his own creation. His absence was interpreted as cowardice by some, cunning by others. Cartoons depicted him as bloated and smug, the banker who outlived his rivals not by chance, but by choice. For society gossips, the mistress theory was far more fun. Ladies whispered over tea about the real reason Morgan had stayed behind. Some even embroidered the tale with details, naming this or that companion, hinting at late-night dinners in Aix-les-Bains, painting Morgan as a character from a scandalous French novel rather than a Wall Street titan. And for conspiracy theorists, Morgan became the puppet master of fate. The Titanic's iceberg was transformed from an accident of nature into an act of narrative, the perfect backdrop for claims that Morgan had maneuvered events to rid himself of rivals or profit from loss. The fact that so many wealthy men died while Morgan lived was too tantalizing to leave unexplained. But perhaps the most interesting part of this legacy is how it stuck. Other passengers cancelled their voyages too. Some for business, others for illness, others by sheer coincidence. Yet none became the subject of a century of theories. Only Morgan. Why? Because Morgan was already seen as more than a man. He was a symbol of money, power, and arrogance. He was the banker who could topple industries, the art collector who bought entire European treasures, the man with a purple nose, who nevertheless had the ear of kings and presidents. His absence wasn't just a missing name on a passenger list. It was a reflection of the world's unease with how much power one man could hold. Even after his death in 1913, the whispers continued. His funeral was attended by presidents and kings, but in the gossip columns, people were still asking, why didn't he sail? The answer hardly mattered anymore. The theories had become the story. And that's how Morgan's Titanic no-show outlived, not as a detail of logistics, not as an excuse of health, but as a story. One that combined glamour, power, scandal, and mystery in exactly the proportions that ensured it would never be forgotten. By the time the Titanic's wreckage settled into the Atlantic, J.P. Morgan was already something larger than life. To the public, he was a caricature, the Napoleon of Wall Street, the monopolist with a purple nose, the banker who held America in his iron grip. His absence from the Titanic folded neatly into that image. To many, it felt like proof that Morgan lived above ordinary fate, too wealthy, too powerful, too calculating to drown like the rest. But the truth, as always, was more complicated. In reality, Morgan was 75 years old, overweight, and suffering from numerous health conditions. He had been in decline for years. His decision to remain in Aix-les-Bains may have been less about cunning foresight and more about aching joints, exhaustion, and the quiet lure of a spa town where no one expected him to sit through banquets or congressional hearings. Morgan himself hated publicity. He avoided cameras, loathed journalists, and once physically struck a photographer who dared to capture his disfigured nose without permission. For a man so allergic to scrutiny, the idea that he deliberately avoided the Titanic for shadowy reasons seems almost comical. He didn't need conspiracies to make headlines. His very existence did that already. And yet, reputation has a way of bending reality. In 1912, Morgan had just endured a bruising fight with Congress over the so-called money trust, accused of controlling too much of America's financial system. He was seen as arrogant, imperious, untouchable. So when he missed the Titanic, people didn't imagine a tired old man preferring mineral baths. They imagined the financial mastermind smirking behind his cigar, choosing life while others drowned. This is the problem with living as a symbol. Once people see you as the embodiment of wealth and power, every act, even the ordinary ones, takes on exaggerated meaning. A missed ship becomes fate. A spa holiday becomes a scandal. An illness becomes a conspiracy. Morgan may not have intended to create drama by cancelling his ticket, but in the theatre of public imagination, he was always centre stage. And perhaps he knew it too. For all his supposed hatred of publicity, Morgan was no fool. He understood reputation was its own form of capital. If people saw him as untouchable, that perception only reinforced his power. So while others speculated endlessly about his absence, Morgan never offered much clarification. He let the gossip swirl, the mystery grew. He stayed silent, and in doing so, he added to the myth. When J.P. Morgan died less than a year after the Titanic disaster, in March 1913, the world mourned, but also marveled. His fortune, at around $80 million, was far less than Rockefeller's, but his influence had been unrivaled. Presidents had deferred to him. Kings had sought his company. Industries had been shaped at his desk. And hovering just behind the obituaries was the Titanic. The story of the billionaire who didn't board had already lodged itself in the public imagination. It was retold at dinner parties, reprinted in gossip columns, embroidered with each retelling. It was the detail that gave his life a final, almost supernatural twist. The man who seemed to rule fate had, in his last year of life, sidestepped the most famous disaster of his age. The myth grew stronger with time. Later generations rediscovered the Titanic, especially after the wreck was found in 1985, and with each revival, Morgan's name returned. Documentaries, books, podcasts, all loved to mention the empty suite, the cancelled ticket, the spa town in France. Conspiracy theories found fertile ground on the internet, spinning wild tales about Morgan orchestrating the disaster to eliminate rivals or profit from chaos. But what's most revealing is why the myth stuck. It wasn't because people truly believed Morgan staged the sinking. It was because the story distilled everything people already felt about him, that he was too rich, too powerful, too separate from ordinary life. His absence from the Titanic became a metaphor for inequality itself. Others drowned. Morgan survived. Others trusted in the unsinkable ship. Morgan trusted his own instincts, or perhaps his own indulgences. And so the myth endured because it was satisfying. It gave a face to survival, a villain to fate, a narrative thread that tied together wealth, scandal, and disaster. Even if the truth was mundane, an old man skipping a ship for a spa, the legend was too good to let go. Today, More than a century later, Morgan's Titanic no-show still fascinates because it combines everything irresistible: glamour, tragedy, power, and mystery. It reminds us that history's greatest stories aren't always about what happened, but about what people believe might have happened. And J.P. Morgan, in life and in death, was always more myth than man. If Morgan's absence from the Titanic was scandalous, what happened afterward only added to the whispers. Let's start with the mistress. In Aix-les-Bains, Morgan had been seen in the company of a young French woman, sometimes described as a companion, sometimes simply as a lady friend. Society never named her outright, but the press hinted broadly enough that no one doubted why Morgan had chosen the spa over the ship. After the disaster, this mysterious companion disappeared back into the shadows of gossip. She was neither acknowledged by Morgan nor written into the official record, but in salons and smoking rooms, people remembered her. While the Titanic sank, one Parisian wag quipped, Morgan was enjoying dessert. It was the kind of line that kept the mistress theory alive, even if her name never did. For Morgan's reputation, this silence was convenient. By keeping his private life private, he avoided a direct scandal. But the implication remained, whispered over teacups and clinking glasses. In many ways, the unnamed mistress became part of the Titanic legend herself. Faceless, nameless, but blamed or credited with saving Morgan's life. Then there was the fate of his shipping empire. Morgan's International Mercantile Marine Company had staked its pride on the Titanic and her sister ships, the Olympic and the Britannic. The Titanic disaster was a devastating blow, not just financially, but symbolically. The unsinkable ship had sunk, and suddenly the White Star Line was a punchline instead of a bragging right. Public trust in the IMM wavered, lawsuits mounted, survivors demanded compensation, and rival companies like Cunard, with its Carpathia basking in glory as the rescue ship, gained the upper hand. The Titanic disaster exposed the cracks in Morgan's shipping monopoly. In the years that followed, IMM struggled financially, its prestige forever tarnished by the iceberg in April 1912. Morgan himself, already frail, lived barely a year beyond the sinking. He died in March 1913, leaving behind a fortune, a legacy of power, and an unanswered question. Had his absence from the Titanic been luck, scandal, or strategy? His shipping trust limped on, a shadow of its former self, its reputation scarred beyond repair. In the end, it's almost poetic. The mistress faded into whispers. The shipping company stumbled toward irrelevance. But the story of Morgan and the Titanic only grew. The ship was gone, the empire damaged, the man buried, but the legend of the empty suite endured. Looking back, the most striking part of J.P. Morgan's Titanic story isn't just that he missed the ship. It's how he managed to keep the truth of it so thoroughly cloaked in mystery. Was it an illness? Was it passion? Was it calculation? Even now, over a century later, we don't have a definitive answer. We have only fragments, sightings at Aix-les-Bains, vague press statements, whispered names, and a suite left eerily empty. And here's what makes that so odd to us today. In our modern world, secrets are nearly impossible to keep. If Morgan were alive now, there would be paparazzi photos of him leaving the spa, blurry cell phone videos of him strolling with his mistress, leaks on social media tracking his every move. 100 podcasts would speculate on his absence before the Titanic even sailed. His excuses would be dissected on Twitter within minutes. But in 1912, privacy was a privilege that the wealthy could still command. Newspapers rarely printed the names of mistresses. Scandals remained in the realm of salon gossip rather than splashed across headlines. Morgan could vanish into the Alps and emerge weeks later without anyone producing proof of what he had been doing. His life existed in shadows, and he preferred it that way. That privacy is part of why his legend endures, because the less we know, the more we imagine. The gaps in his story invite invention, and the invention becomes myth. The absence of Morgan on the Titanic became a canvas onto which people projected their fears, their suspicions, their fantasies about wealth and power. He became the archetype of the man too rich, too calculating, or too lucky to die with the rest. And in the end, maybe that's the real legacy. Not the shipping empire that collapsed, not even the art collections he left behind, but the story, the whisper that J.P. Morgan had a suite on the Titanic and never boarded. That he escaped death not with foresight or courage, but with secrecy, indulgence, and perhaps a dash of scandal. It's a story tailor-made for us to keep retelling because it sits at the intersection of everything irresistible: glamour, tragedy, wealth, and mystery. And like all the best legends, it tells us as much about ourselves as it does about him. And that brings us to the end of tonight's story. J.P. Morgan never set foot on the Titanic, but his absence has haunted its history ever since. Was it illness, romance, conspiracy, or simply coincidence? We may never know for certain. What we do know is that the man who financed the ship, the man who lived at the very peak of wealth and power, somehow managed to sidestep one of history's greatest tragedies and carry the mystery with him to his grave. If you enjoyed tonight's tale, please tap the like button, subscribe for more journeys into the quieter corners of history, and let me know in the comments where you're listening from. I always love hearing where these stories are keeping you company. Until next time, sleep well, dream of gilded suites and unsolved mysteries, and I'll see you in the next story. Script written by Clara Finch, because good stories always deserve a soul.